In the dead of winter, a desperate little boy steals food to keep his sick sister alive. Kicked out of the only home he's ever known, he's left with nothing. Just as he's about to lose all hope, a millionaire walks in, and everything changes in an instant. Before we dive into the story, leave a comment below and let me know which city you are watching from. Let's get started. In the dead of winter. Pine Hollow stood as a ghost town, its past long buried beneath the dusting of snow and the weight of years gone by. The wind howled through the broken windows of abandoned homes, scraping across old farm fields where crops once thrived, but now only barren, lifeless earth remained. At the edge of this crumbling town, tucked away behind a fence that had seen better days, stood a dilapidated farmhouse. The paint had long since peeled away, revealing the bones of the house that once housed a family full of life and love. Now the structure creaked in the biting wind, its silent walls whispering the tragic story of a family forgotten by time and the cruelty of circumstance. This was the place where Jack Carter and his younger sister Emily had been left to weather the storm of their lives. The harsh winter wind pressed against the house like a suffocating hand, wrapping the land in a blanket of snow and loneliness. Inside the house was colder than the frost that clung to the windows, its rooms silent except for the soft sound of Emily's labored breathing. She was 5, her frail body wrapped in the tattered quilt Jack had made for her, the same one she had clung to since their parents' deaths. It wasn't enough to keep the chill of winter from seeping into her bones. Every night, the fever came a relentless burning heat that made her small frame tremble uncontrollably. Jack could feel her pain, her tiny body twitching under his watchful eye as she lay in the makeshift bed they had made for her. But there was nothing Jack could do. The medicine they had left behind was long gone, and the only thing left in the cupboard was a half-empty can of beans, a few stale crackers, and the small scraps of hope that still clung to him, though just barely. Jack was no stranger to pain. He was 10 already, carrying the weight of the world on his thin shoulders, though no one could see the burden. He had been forced to grow up quickly, long before any child should have. When their parents died in a car accident, Jack had not just lost his mother and father. He had lost the only thing that kept him tethered to a world of warmth and comfort. He remembered the days before the accident, before the house had fallen into disrepair, before the world turned cold. His mother's laughter still echoed in his memory, the sound of her humming as she worked in the kitchen. His father's hands, calloused from years of hard work, had always been strong hands that once held Jack and Emily close, protecting them from the dangers of the world. But that was before. Now those hands were just a memory, a shadow that haunted the corners of his mind, reminding him of everything he had lost. But the loss of his parents was nothing compared to the cruelty that awaited him in the house that was supposed to be his refuge. Lena and Mike Carter. His aunt and uncle had taken him in after the accident, but there was no love in their hearts for him or Emily. They didn't see them as family. They saw them as burdens. The house, once filled with the scent of warm meals and laughter, now reeked of neglect and cold indifference. Lena, his aunt, was bitter, her sharp eyes always calculating, always scheming. She never once spoke of their parents, never once treated them as anything more than a reminder of her husband's selfishness in taking them in. Mike, her husband, was no better. He spent most of his days drinking away the little money they had, leaving Jack and Emily to fend for themselves. There was no warmth in the walls of that house, just the coldness of a family that had lost its way. That night, as Jack sat on the edge of Emily's bed, his hands gently brushing her damp forehead, he could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. Emily's small form shivered in his arms, her body too weak to fight off the fever that had overtaken her. The old quilt, which was all they had for warmth, wasn't enough to keep the cold at bay. Jack looked out the cracked window at the snow falling in thick flakes, the world outside, just as cold and unforgiving as the one inside the house. It was the middle of the night, but Jack couldn't sleep. He never could when Emily was sick. She needed more than the scraps they had, more than the stolen moments of warmth he tried to give her. She needed medicine, she needed food, and she needed a life that wasn't defined by cold and neglect. But where would it come from? Where could he find the strength to carry her, to keep them both alive, when everything around them seemed intent on dragging them down? In the distance, the sound of a car engine pierced the night, a smooth hum that contrasted sharply with the howling wind. Jack's heart skipped a beat as the headlights illuminated the snow-covered ground, casting long shadows across the yard. It was strange no one came to Pine Hollow anymore. The town was forgotten, abandoned by everyone except the ones who had no place else to go. But this car, sleek and polished against the drab backdrop of their broken home, felt like a beacon in the darkness. Jack didn't know why, but something in his gut told him that this was different, that maybe this moment would change everything. The car pulled up to the edge of the driveway, the engine cutting off with a soft hiss. Jack stood up, holding Emily in his arms, and moved cautiously toward the door, his breath fogging in the cold air. He peeked through the crack in the door, his eyes squinting against the bright lights of the car. A figure stepped out tall with broad shoulders and an air of calm authority that seemed out of place in this desolate town. The man's suit gleamed even in the dim light, a sharp contrast to the worn-out house behind him. Jack's heart raced. Who was this man? What was he doing here? The man took a few steps toward the porch, his gaze catching Jack's from across the yard. For a moment time seemed to stand still. Jack felt his breath catch in his throat, his mind racing. Who was he? Why was he here? The man stopped just short of the porch, his eyes locking with Jack's. There was no fear in the man's gaze, only quiet strength, as if he had seen and survived things far worse than what lay before him. Is she all right? The man's voice cut through the silence, soft yet firm. His words held an unspoken question, one that Jack couldn't answer right away. His mind was clouded with confusion, with hope, with a desperate need to believe that someone, anyone, could help. I don't know, Jack whispered, his voice breaking. She's sick. She's always sick. And I don't know how to help her anymore. The man took another step forward, his gaze never leaving Jack's face. I can help, he said simply, his voice a promise. I'll take care of her. In that moment, Jack's world shifted. The stranger's words were a lifeline thrown into the dark, cold sea of his despair. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jack allowed himself to believe that help was possible, that someone might see them not as burdens, but as human beings deserving of care. The man reached into the car, pulling out a medical kit and a few bags of groceries, his movements practiced and sure. I'm David Green, he said, his tone warm, but not overly familiar. And I'm here to make sure you and your sister get through this. Jack looked at him, disbelief written on his face. He had never seen kindness like this, certainly not from his aunt and uncle who had shown him nothing but disdain. But David's words were a balm to the deep cuts of neglect he had lived with for so long. Maybe this was the moment everything would change. David Green's presence in Pine Hollow felt like a spark in a room that had been enveloped by darkness for years. His calm demeanor and unwavering resolve seemed to defy the bleakness that had smothered the Carter family home. As Jack watched the man still gripping Emily tightly in his arms, he felt an unfamiliar sensation, hope. Hope, a feeling Jack hadn't dared to entertain for a long time, was suddenly alive in his chest, fluttering like the fragile wings of a bird trying to take flight. He'd been so used to the cold, so used to the silence that screamed louder than any words ever could. But David Green wasn't cold. His eyes, despite the solemnity they carried, were full of understanding and empathy, as though he knew the weight of loss and suffering, but still believed in the possibility of kindness. Jack, too cautious to believe this man could change anything, didn't know what to do with this new, unsettling hope that was blooming inside him. He looked at David, unsure if he should speak, unsure if his fragile world would crumble the moment he dared to trust someone outside the walls of his own suffering. David, sensing Jack's hesitation, didn't rush him. He simply crouched down, his eyes softening as he looked at Emily, who lay in Jack's arms, her feverish face flushed with heat. He placed a gentle hand on her forehead, his fingers warm, and for a moment everything about the world outside seemed to fade away. "She needs a doctor," David said softly, but there was a weight in his voice, a quiet urgency that sent Jack's pulse racing. Emily had been sick for too long without proper care, too long without anyone who truly cared enough to help. David turned to Jack, his face serious but kind. "And you, Jack? You're doing your best, but you can't carry this alone? You shouldn't have to." Jack swallowed hard, feeling the lump in his throat growing larger. He hadn't heard anyone say those words in so long, "you shouldn't have to." He felt his shoulders tremble under the strain of years spent carrying burdens far too heavy for someone his age. All he had ever known was struggle. Struggling to survive under the weight of neglect, struggling to protect Emily from the callous indifference of their relatives, struggling to make sense of the loss of their parents. And now standing in front of him was a man, a stranger, offering help, offering kindness, offering care in a world that had given him nothing but pain. David straightened his eyes, scanning the small, decaying house, with a subtle furrow of concern on his brow. Jack could feel the man's gaze, and it wasn't one of judgment, but one of understanding, as though David knew exactly what had been happening behind those walls, knew exactly what kind of life Jack and Emily had been forced to endure. The weight of it all, of the neglect, of the constant worry for Emily's health, of the silent battle to survive in the face of cruelty, suddenly felt like it was too much to carry. But then David spoke again, his voice steady and certain, grounding Jack in the present moment. "I'm going to get you the help you need, Jack," David said. "And you're not alone anymore. You and Emily are going to be all right. We'll make sure of it." Jack couldn't help but stare at him, trying to make sense of the words. Was it possible? Could someone really help them? Could someone who wasn't obligated by blood or duty, someone who had nothing to gain from their suffering, actually care enough to intervene? For years, Jack had been surrounded by people who pretended not to see him, not to see Emily's illness, not to see their struggles. But here was a man who, despite having no reason to, was offering them something none of their relatives ever had hope. Jack's hand tightened around Emily's small, frail body, as if to anchor himself in this moment, to hold on to this feeling that was so foreign to him. David didn't ask for anything in return. He didn't ask Jack to explain his situation, didn't ask him to beg for help, didn't demand gratitude. He simply acted. He pulled out his phone and made a call, his tone calm but firm, arranging for a doctor to come to the house immediately. He promised Jack that Emily would be seen by someone who cared, that she wouldn't have to suffer any longer. "I'll be here every step of the way." David said, his words sinking into Jack's chest like a soothing balm. "You don't have to carry this alone. We'll take care of her together." The words felt like a lifeline being thrown into the stormy sea of Jack's despair. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack allowed himself to believe just for a moment that this might not be the end of the road for him and Emily. Perhaps this was the beginning of something new, something better. He had no idea how David had come to be here, or why he had chosen to help them, but in that moment Jack felt something deep inside him shift. He didn't have to be the only one fighting anymore. For the first time in his life, someone was fighting with him. The door to the house creaked open, and Jack's attention snapped back to reality. A woman dressed in a white coat stepped inside. She was carrying a medical bag, and Jack noticed the look of concern on her face as she approached them. David introduced her as Dr. Carla Harper, a local pediatrician, and explained Emily's condition. The doctor nodded, her expression both professional and warm. She moved toward Emily with practiced care, her hands gentle as she took Emily's temperature and checked her vitals. Jack stood back, his heart pounding in his chest, as he watched, feeling both a strange sense of relief and a deep, gnawing fear. Was Emily going to be okay? Was he finally going to get the help he had been so desperately searching for? Dr. Harper spoke softly as she examined Emily, reassuring Jack that they would do everything they could to help her. It looks like she's suffering from a severe fever, probably caused by an infection. She's dehydrated and she needs antibiotics. I'm going to start an IV to get her fluids up, and I'll make sure she's as comfortable as possible while we monitor her progress. Jack couldn't believe it. For the first time, someone was taking Emily's illness seriously. There was no more ignoring her cries, no more pretending that things would get better on their own. Someone was finally doing something. It was as if the weight of years of suffering had suddenly been lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a sense of responsibility and determination that he hadn't felt in so long. Maybe they were going to be okay. As Dr. Harper worked, David turned to Jack, his eyes softening with understanding. "You've done everything you could," Jack David said quietly. "But you can't do this alone. You've been strong for so long. It's time for you to take a step back and let someone else help." Jack nodded slowly, the words sinking into him like stones in a pond. It was hard to let go, hard to trust that someone else could take over the burden of his sister's care. But he knew deep down that this was the right thing to do. He wasn't alone anymore. The hours passed, and Emily's condition slowly began to improve. David stayed by their side, never once leaving the house. He made sure Jack had everything he needed, ensuring that the family was taken care of while Emily rested. Jack watched, his heart swelling with a sense of gratitude he hadn't known existed, as he saw the genuine care David showed them both. It wasn't just the medicine, or the food, or the supplies that made the difference. It was the presence of someone who cared, someone who refused to let them slip through the cracks. For the first time in years, Jack felt the possibility of a future one, where he and Emily wouldn't have to fight to survive. As night fell, and Emily finally settled into a peaceful sleep, Jack stood by the window looking out into the darkened landscape of Pine Hollow. The snow was still falling, but this time it didn't seem so cold. There was warmth in the house now. There was hope. And for the first time in a long while, Jack allowed himself to believe that they could have a future, one that wasn't defined by loss, by neglect, or by survival. It was a future that could be filled with care, with kindness, and with the quiet strength of a family brought together by nothing more than a simple act of compassion. The journey was far from over, but as Jack turned away from the window and looked back at the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the room where Emily slept, he knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. The days that followed were a strange, unsettling mix of relief and tension. Jack had never experienced anything like it, moments of peace intertwined with the shadow of uncertainty that still lingered over him and Emily. The house, once filled with the echoes of neglect, was now alive with action. Dr. Harper continued to visit, bringing with her supplies and medications that helped Emily's fever slowly subside. The warmth of the fire that David had started in the hearth never seemed to fade, as if it was constantly fighting off the cold of the world outside, as if it was an effort to keep the shadows from creeping back in. But the warmth of the fire couldn't chase away the gnawing reality Jack was still unsure of what would happen next. They had been given a lifeline. But could it really save them from the life they had endured for so long? David didn't speak of the future directly, but there was something in his presence that suggested he was already planning, already taking the steps to ensure that the siblings wouldn't fall back into the abyss they had just barely managed to climb out of. Jack, though, couldn't let himself believe in the permanence of it. This was all too new, too much to absorb at once. The tenderness that David showed them was both a comfort and a source of fear. He was acting like a protector, but the question that always haunted Jack was, why? Why was David doing this for them? He could have walked away after providing a few supplies, after helping Emily through her worst night. But David had stayed. He had stayed when he didn't have to, when the weight of their broken lives could have easily been shrugged off by someone else. He hadn't just given them milk medicine and a roof for the night. He had given them something infinitely more precious, a sense of dignity, of hope, of the possibility of something better. But as the days passed, Jack could feel the old tension building again, the one that came from feeling vulnerable, from relying on someone else. He had never allowed himself to depend on anyone, especially not adults, who had promised care only to fail them when it mattered most. His Aunt Lena had long ago broken the promise of a safe home, and Mike had never really been a figure of security, more a shadow of disappointment. Jack was used to relying on his own instincts, his own strength to survive. Relying on David, he thought, could be dangerous. He didn't want to become a burden again. He didn't want to be vulnerable to someone else's whims, especially not after everything they had been through. But as the hours slipped into days, something changed in Jack. He couldn't ignore the difference in how David treated them, how David treated him. There was no agenda, no hidden cost to his kindness. David's visits weren't fleeting. They were consistent, thoughtful, and calm. David would sit down with Jack after Emily fell asleep, asking him questions, small ones at first, about what his parents were like, about the things Jack liked to do before everything fell apart. David never rushed him. He just listened. For the first time, Jack realized how much he had yearned for someone to listen to him. He hadn't realized how much he'd been bottling up, how much he had stored away in his heart to survive, to be strong for Emily. He couldn't remember the last time someone had asked him what he needed, what he wanted. One evening, as snow began to fall again outside, David's voice broke the quiet. "Jack," he began, his tone different tonight, softer somehow. "I know this may be hard for you to understand right now, but I'm not just here for a moment. I'm not just here to fix Emily's fever and leave." Jack felt the familiar knot in his stomach tighten as he turned his gaze away from the fire. "You and Emily. You're not alone anymore. You don't have to fight for survival every day. There's room for you both in my life if you'll let me help." Jack's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to say something sharp, something defensive to protect the fragile thread of control he had left. But the words wouldn't come. How could he let himself trust this man? How could he let someone else get close enough to hurt him, to make promises that could end just like the others? He wasn't a fool. The world wasn't kind to kids like him. His mother used to tell him that the world could be cold, that life would break his heart before he had a chance to build it. And yet here was David offering him something different, something that felt real. David seemed to sense Jack's hesitation. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful, as if weighing every word before he spoke. "I get it," David said quietly. "You're used to fighting for everything, to being the strong one, the one who looks out for everyone else." He paused, his voice steady, but laced with an unspoken understanding. "But Jack, sometimes being strong means knowing when you need help. It's okay to let someone else carry the weight for a while." Jack wanted to argue, to push away the kindness that David was offering, but something stopped him. His heart, raw and battered from years of neglect, wanted so desperately to believe him. He thought of Emily, of her thin little frame, of the nights she had spent in feverish pain, while Jack struggled to hold her together with nothing more than his willpower. This time he thought it could be different. But even as the thought took root, a gnawing fear clawed at Jack's chest. The worst part wasn't the idea of trusting David. It was the thought that once they let someone else into their lives, they would have to give up control. And giving up control meant being vulnerable again, something Jack had learned never to do. There was a faint, broken part of him that feared letting David too far into their lives. What if this man wasn't as trustworthy as he appeared? What if Jack opened his heart only to find it shattered again? His mind raced, and for a moment the weight of everything, the fear, the pain, the memories of neglect, pushed against him like an invisible force. David, sensing the shift in Jack's energy, stood up and walked over to the boy. He knelt down, his hands resting gently on Jack's shoulders, grounding him. His voice was calm, unwavering, yet full of something deeper, something Jack couldn't quite place. "I'm not going anywhere, Jack, and neither are you. Emily needs you and I need you. I'm here to stay." For a moment, Jack couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All he could do was stare at David, his eyes wide and unblinking, as if trying to see through the layers of his words, trying to find the catch, the condition that might follow. But there was none. There was no agenda in David's eyes, no hidden cost to his kindness. All Jack saw was someone who genuinely cared for him and Emily. For the first time, the weight of his world didn't feel so heavy. Over the next few days, David's presence in their lives began to feel less like an intrusion and more like a steady anchor. He wasn't there to replace their parents or to make promises he couldn't keep. He was simply there day after day, offering help, offering his time, his support, and his belief in their future. Slowly, the walls Jack had built around his heart began to crack little by little, like the thawing of ice in spring. He didn't trust easily, but he couldn't deny the warmth that grew in his chest each time David showed up at their doorstep. Each time he made sure Emily's fever was being treated, each time he asked how Jack was doing, without the expectation of anything in return. But even as Jack began to feel the first real stirrings of hope, he couldn't shake the fear that one day it would all come crashing down again. Trust was a fragile thing, and he wasn't sure he was ready to offer it to someone else again. Could David really offer them the security they needed? Could this man, this stranger, actually become the father figure Jack had always longed for? As Jack lay awake that night, listening to the soft breath of Emily as she slept beside him, he realized something. David wasn't offering them just a safe place to stay or just medical care. He was offering them the chance to live, to be more than just survivors. David's help was the beginning of something Jack had thought impossible, a chance to rebuild, to become a family again. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, Jack felt that maybe it could be something good. The days that followed were a mixture of relief and struggle. David's presence had brought a new kind of stability to the house, one that felt foreign and fragile. For Jack, the initial relief was soon tempered by a growing uncertainty. The weight of his past, the years of neglect, the painful knowledge that he had learned to survive in a world that had refused to care for him, was hard to shake. He had spent so long in a state of constant vigilance, always on edge, always looking out for danger, that the idea of peace, of real security, was almost impossible to accept. But as the snow continued to blanket Pine Hollow and the house slowly grew warmer, a sense of calm began to settle into Jack's heart, even if he refused to fully acknowledge it. There was something about David, about his quiet confidence and steadfast care, that kept Jack from sinking back into the darkness. David wasn't just providing food and shelter. He was providing a space where Jack could breathe, where he could start to think about something beyond mere survival. But even as the days passed, Jack found himself torn between the hope that David could offer and the fierce independence that had kept him alive for so long. Jack had always been the one to protect Emily, to fight for them both, to keep them from falling through the cracks. And yet, despite his best efforts, it had never been enough. David had stepped in, and for the first time in Jack's life, someone else was doing the heavy lifting. David made sure Emily's medical needs were met, that she got the nutrition she needed, and that Jack's emotional wounds began to heal. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that all of this kindness, this safety came at a cost. He had learned early that people didn't give things for free. There was always an expectation, a price to pay. And Jack, despite everything, was still deeply skeptical of anyone who claimed to care without asking for something in return. The longer David stayed in their lives, the more Jack wrestled with his own feelings of inadequacy. He wasn't used to being taken care of. He was used to taking care of others. As the snow continued to fall in heavy sheets outside, Jack found himself in the kitchen one afternoon, his hands moving mechanically as he chopped vegetables for the soup David had promised to make for dinner. The sound of the knife against the cutting board was oddly comforting, a reminder of the normalcy that David had brought into their lives. He glanced up to see David sitting at the table, a stack of papers in front of him, his brow furrowed in concentration. It wasn't unusual for David to be focused on something, but there was a sense of urgency in his demeanor that caught Jack's attention. He wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over, standing quietly next to David. David didn't look up at first. "You're cooking, I see," he said with a small smile, his voice soft but tired. "I'm just trying to help," Jack muttered, unsure if he wanted David's attention. He had always been the one to take charge, to make sure things were running smoothly, even in the chaos. It was hard to relinquish control, to step into a role that wasn't just about survival. David set the papers down and finally met Jack's eyes. There was something in his gaze that made Jack pause, something that seemed to reach beyond the surface of their lives. "I know you're trying, Jack, but you don't have to keep everything together by yourself anymore." His voice was calm, like a steady hand on Jack's shoulder. "You can let me help. You can let go. It's okay." Jack's stomach twisted and he forced himself to look away. "I don't need anyone's help. I can handle it," he said, though the words felt hollow even to him. David's expression softened. "I know you can, but you don't have to. There's a difference between being strong and being alone." The words hit Jack harder than he anticipated. He stood there still and silent, trying to make sense of what David was offering, what he had already given. The quiet compassion, the protection, the willingness to be there for them without any expectation. It was all so new, so foreign, that Jack couldn't quite wrap his mind around it. It felt like too much had changed too quickly. For the first time in his life, he was learning to rely on someone else, and the process was both terrifying and liberating. He wanted to believe, but the fear was still there, gnawing at him from the inside out. "You're not alone," David said again, his voice low but firm. "You don't have to do this by yourself. I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." Jack felt his throat tighten. The words David had spoken felt like an anchor, but the weight of his own skepticism kept him tethered to the edge of the unknown. How could he trust that this wasn't just another fleeting kindness? He didn't want to be a burden, didn't want to depend on someone who might turn away when things got hard. But as he stood there with David's gaze steady and unwavering, Jack realized something he hadn't allowed himself to see before. Maybe it was okay to accept help. Maybe it wasn't about being strong all the time. It was about being willing to let someone else carry some of the weight. David didn't push. didn't try to force Jack to accept anything he wasn't ready for. Instead, he simply offered his presence, his support, and his commitment. "You're family now," Jack David said, as if the words were simple truth. "And family takes care of each other." That night, as they sat down to the warm soup David had made and shared a meal together, Jack felt something inside him shift. It wasn't a huge, dramatic change. It was quieter than that. But it was there, a tiny crack in the armor he had spent so many years building, a small crack that allowed a little bit of light to seep through. And as the days passed, as Emily continued to improve, and Jack's guard slowly began to fall, he realized that he was learning to trust not just David, but himself. He was learning that being strong didn't mean carrying everything on his own, that real strength came from allowing others to help, from being vulnerable when it mattered most. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but Jack began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Real hope, not just the kind that whispered in the back of his mind when things were quiet, but the kind that stood up in the light of day, the kind that said, maybe things could be different. David's presence, his unwavering support, became the foundation for something new. Jack didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone anymore. The family he had always dreamed of, the family he had fought for without ever knowing how to ask for it, was finally beginning to take shape. And for the first time in his life, Jack felt like he could breathe, like the weight of the world didn't have to be on his shoulders alone. But even as Jack allowed himself to trust, to lean into the safety David offered, there were still moments when the past crept in, when the old fear whispered in his ear, reminding him of everything he had lost, everything he feared would be taken away again. But David was there, always there, like the steady hand on Jack's back, guiding him through the uncertainty. With each passing day, Jack learned to let go, to embrace the care that was being offered, and to step into a future that no longer had to be defined by pain and struggle. As the weeks wore on, the house grew warmer, not just from the fire, but from the bond that was beginning to form between them. David wasn't just a stranger offering help anymore. He was family. And for Jack, that was enough to start building something new, something worth fighting for. The passage of time, though gradual, began to reshape everything for Jack and Emily. Their lives, once defined by survival, were slowly transitioning into something more enduring, more stable, like the steady thaw of winter after months of ice and snow. David's presence had been a constant, a reassurance, like the lighthouse shining its steady beam through the darkest storms. The fear of the unknown, of being cast aside again, was still an unwelcome visitor at times, lingering at the edges of Jack's mind. But each day, as Jack and Emily adjusted to the routines that David had begun to weave into their lives, they felt something remarkable begin to unfold: trust. Not just trust in David, but trust in the possibility of home. It was a feeling so foreign that Jack couldn't always name it, but it was there, growing like a seed, buried deep in the cold soil, pushing through the hard earth toward the warmth of the sun. Jack had always been the one to take charge, the one to hold the weight of responsibility for both himself and Emily. But as the days passed, he began to notice a subtle shift in his own heart. There was a peace in the home. Now, a rhythm that wasn't just about surviving the next day or the next crisis. David's presence had brought with it a sense of normalcy, a word that had felt so out of reach for Jack, as if it were something that belonged to people who lived in another world, a world that wasn't fractured by loss and pain. But as they all sat together at the dinner table one evening, Jack, Emily, David, and even Michael and Daniel, who had begun to warm to the idea of being part of a family, Jack realized that normal wasn't so unattainable after all. David, who had become something of a quiet leader in their little unit, had already set about making plans for their future. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about living. He had enrolled Emily in a local clinic for follow-up care, making sure she was on the path to full recovery. He had taken the time to listen to Jack, really listen, not just to what he said, but to what he didn't say. The small details that Jack had buried deep the parts of himself he had forgotten or suppressed in order to survive. David's patience, his willingness to listen, had slowly chipped away at the walls Jack had so carefully constructed around his heart. It wasn't just about feeling safe physically. It was about feeling seen, about feeling like he mattered. But even as the layers of trust began to form, there was still the undercurrent of fear that Jack couldn't shake. The thought that at any moment this fragile family could be torn apart still haunted him. He had seen it too many times before adults who had promised things they couldn't deliver, promises that had been broken as easily as glass shattering against the floor. The thought that this too might be fleeting, that David might one day decide that they weren't worth the trouble, crept into Jack's mind like a cold wind. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house settled into the familiar hum of nighttime, Jack found himself sitting at the kitchen table staring out the window at the now quiet street. The lights from the nearby houses twinkled faintly, reflecting off the snow that covered the ground like a blanket. It was peaceful outside, the kind of peace Jack had never known. It was then that David walked into the room, his footsteps soft on the floorboards. Without a word, he sat down across from Jack, his presence as steady as always. Jack didn't look at him immediately. He wasn't sure how to begin, how to express the knot of fear and uncertainty that had formed in his chest. David seemed to sense it, and after a long pause, he spoke softly. "I know you're worried, Jack," he said, his voice low and gentle. "And I get it. You've had to carry the weight for so long that it's hard to imagine a world where you don't have to do everything yourself." Jack finally met David's gaze, his eyes flickering with the emotion he hadn't let himself express in months. "I don't want to be a burden." Jack said, his voice rough with the words that had been buried for so long. "I don't want to need anyone. I've always had to take care of things of Emily. I'm not used to someone else doing it for me." David's gaze softened, and he leaned forward slightly, his hands folded calmly in front of him. "You're not a burden, Jack," he said firmly. "And you don't have to carry this alone anymore. No one should have to do that. You're not asking for too much by letting me help. You deserve to have someone who's there for you just like you've been there for Emily. You've given so much, Jack. You've been the one holding everything together even when it was falling apart." Jack swallowed hard, feeling the weight of David's words pressing down on him. The truth of what David was saying was almost too much to bear. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged the sacrifices Jack had made, the burden he had carried, without ever complaining, without ever asking for help. And as much as he wanted to deny it, as much as he wanted to keep holding on to the facade of self-sufficiency, he knew deep down that David was right. Jack had done all of this alone, and it had nearly destroyed him. It was only now, with David's help, that Jack was beginning to see how much of himself he had buried in the process of trying to survive. "I don't know how to let go of this fear," Jack admitted, his voice small. "I don't know how to trust that this—" He gestured around the room as if the fragile walls of their new life were both a sanctuary and a prison. "I don't know how to believe that it's real." David leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. He didn't rush to answer. He simply let Jack's words hang in the air for a moment, allowing the weight of them to settle. "It's okay to be scared," Jack David said after a pause. "But you don't have to keep living in that fear. Trust takes time. It's not something you can just switch on overnight. But it's a start. And you're not alone in this. You never have to be again." Jack felt a strange, quiet relief wash over him at David's words. The walls around his heart, which had felt impenetrable for so long, began to crack just a little. It wasn't all at once. It was slow, almost imperceptible. But it was there. The fear didn't disappear. It was still there, lurking at the edges of his thoughts. but it didn't control him the way it once had. For the first time in a long time, Jack realized that he didn't have to carry the weight of his past alone. There were people, good people who cared. And maybe there was room for him to believe in that care. In the weeks that followed, the changes in Jack were subtle, but undeniable. He wasn't as quick to shut people out. He allowed himself to lean into the safety that David had provided, not because he expected it to last forever, but because for once it felt right. Emily too began to heal, not just physically, but emotionally. The warmth of the house, the routine that David had established, created an environment in which both Jack and Emily could begin to thrive again. And as Emily's laughter returned to the house, filling the rooms with the sound of innocence and joy, Jack found himself watching her with a deep sense of gratitude. She was still the same fragile little girl, but now she had a chance at a life free from the constant weight of sickness and neglect. David's steady presence had not only brought health and safety to their lives, but it had also restored something even more precious: hope. And as Jack stood in the kitchen one morning watching David prepare breakfast while Emily played with a new toy at the table, Jack finally allowed himself to believe that this small, imperfect, beautiful family was real. They were safe. They were loved. And no matter what came next, they would face it together. The future, once so uncertain, now seemed filled with possibility. There would be challenges ahead, of course, and Jack knew that not everything would be easy. But for the first time, he felt ready to face it. Because this time he wasn't doing it alone. And that made all the difference. The story of Jack and Emily teaches us a powerful lesson about the importance of vulnerability, trust, and the strength that comes from letting others into our lives. For so long, Jack believed that to survive, he had to bear the weight of everything on his own. He thought that being strong meant never needing help, never showing weakness. But through his journey, he learns that real strength isn't about isolation. It's about being able to open yourself to others, to let them support you when the burden becomes too heavy. David, a stranger who becomes a father figure, shows him that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is to allow yourself to be cared for. This story also reminds us that kindness is transformative, that a simple act of compassion can change the trajectory of someone's life. Jack's transformation from a boy forced to carry the weight of his world alone to someone who learns to accept care and support speaks to the power of community love and shared responsibility. We all go through difficult moments when the weight of life feels too much to bear, but the story encourages us to reach out to ask for help and to embrace those who want to walk beside us in our struggles. It's okay to be vulnerable, to trust in others, and to accept kindness without guilt. So I encourage you to reflect on the relationships in your life. Are there people who need your help? Are there times when you might need to lean on others? Don't be afraid to let people in. Sometimes the greatest act of strength is the willingness to ask for support, just as Jack did when he let David into his life. Thank you for taking the time to read and reflect on this story. Life often teaches us its lessons in unexpected ways, and by sharing our stories, we grow stronger together. Please feel free to share your thoughts or experiences in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a moment where letting someone in made all the difference? I'd love to hear from you.